Good evening, tributes, and welcome back to Panem Reborn. I'd like to thank all the usual people for helping with the creation of this video, including Christian Blanco, whose channel is linked below. His series, Tales of the Hunger Games, is the series that this series is based off of. That was a lot of series is. And I'd also like to thank Andrew McLean for providing some of the artwork in this series. His blog is linked below as well, so please check that out if you're interested. I'd also like to thank my editors, Octavian Sthesia and Raby, for providing some assistance with this series. And thank you to all of you who watch, comment, and like this series. I really appreciate it, so thank you so much. And without further ado, let's get started and dive into Panem for today. As it had been for many years and across all three incarnations of Panem, District 1 was known to be a strong force in the games. Yet instead of a talent competition and debate, as had been put in place during the second incarnation, President Mace had ordered that the district return to ordinary reapings from this year onward. This was not for equality purposes among the districts, but rather because the district had not had enough volunteers in the past 3 years to necessitate a narrowing of the reaping pool, likely due to some sentiments of disillusionment by the youths after seeing the district's tributes die in often brutal ways in the past few games, particularly the humiliating deaths of its tributes to the pair of District 3 weaklings in the 102nd Games. Therefore, Austin Clark, victor of the 103rd Hunger Games, arrived in District 1 to perform the reapings shortly after Mayor Glitz gave the annual speech about Panem's revival. As he stepped forward, fanning himself with his hand to avoid the heat since he had been forced into a stuffy three-piece suit for the occasion, he tugged out a slip of paper from the female reaping bowl. Austin read this slip aloud to indicate that 18-year-old Chris Gracely would be the female tribute for this year. Following this, a stunning young woman with flowing blonde hair and sharp green eyes set her mouth in a thin but determined line upon hearing her name, and allowed the peacekeepers to escort her to the stage without complaint. A loud wolf whistle echoed from somewhere in the male reaping section, causing Chris to glare in that general direction. She greeted Austin with a polite handshake and turned to face the crowd as he moved to the male reaping bowl. Austin drew a name from the bowl and read it aloud to the crowd, declaring it to be that of 18-year-old Alexander Nicoline. Immediately, the crowd gasped as both Chris on the stage and a young man in the crowd let out a loud string of profanities. Peacekeepers collected the young man from the male reaping area and presented him on stage, as he was revealed to have warm bronze skin, dark hair, and piercing dark eyes. He trudged up to the stage flanked by a pair of peacekeepers, carefully staring at the ground and only glancing up to shuffle up the stairs. Chris refused to look at her district partner as he reluctantly shook hands with Austin, and they were presented as the tributes from District 1 for the 104th Hunger Games. Rosalia Sanchez remarked that according to her anonymous sources, Alexander and Chris had been in a committed, long-term relationship and had been engaged, but it had ended quite sourly and abruptly shortly before the reaping. She laughed aloud at the thought of this and commented that if she had been reaped alongside her ex, she would likely step off her podium early rather than work with them. Indeed, it appeared that Alexander and Chris would rather have been anywhere else than on national television together at this time, and Rosalia expressed her sympathy for their awkward situation. The pair were visited by family and friends at the Justice Building as usual, with Chris's younger sister making her promise to give 'em hell. Alexander was visited by 2 elderly grandparents and a single mother, whom he comforted and assured that he would do his best. They were then escorted to the train station, still intentionally avoiding eye contact and staying as far away from each other as was physically possible with their peacekeeper entourage. Alexander and Chris were introduced on the train to their capital mentor, a young and orange-haired man named Adrian Murfold. He surveyed them up and down with a grimace, admitting that he had watched their reapings and had been able to feel the tension through his television screen. Frowning at the awkward silence that ensued, he steered them over to a sofa and ordered lemonade. Alexander was the first to break the uncomfortable moment by thanking Adrian for mentoring them and asking for any games advice. Adrian muttered that his first piece of advice would be for the pair to stop treating each other like chopped liver, gesturing at his own plate of foie gras nearby to exemplify his point. However, this joke hung in the air for a few moments before he sighed and agreed to provide them with actual advice, which settled the angry pair of tributes as they sat down attentively to listen. Though the train ride was short and they only had a brief period of time to discuss, Adrian gave his tributes some extra pointers to help them succeed, from choosing the best training stations to determining which districts were threats aside from the twos. As the train pulled into Mace Station and the sounds of cheering Capitolites could be heard from outside the train, Adrian reminded them to keep their chins up and smile, regardless of how they were feeling about being in each other's presence at the moment. The tributes from 1 stepped off the train with Adrian into the assembled crowd. He smartly steered them towards some of the individuals known as big bettors in the capital, who were known to frequently bet on tributes and spend great amounts of money to ensure a win. For the sake of impressing these members of the crowd, Alexander and Chris gritted their teeth into tight smiles and posed for pictures, charming the curious onlookers with their respective charisma and attentively answering any questions they were asked, except for those inquiring about their past relationship. Adrian thanked the crowd for having them, sensing the discomfort in their tense expressions, and escorted them off to their apartment. Once they arrived, Adrian eagerly introduced his tributes to Dardanius Nym, their tearful and charming stylist. Alexander politely asked if he knew Dardanius personally, as they seemed quite close, and Adrian explained that they were in fact engaged to be married the next month. Chris congratulated the pair, although it appeared that she had shot Alexander a dirty look out of the corner of her eye when hearing the nature of Dardanius and Adrian's relationship. Alexander refused to look at Chris at this time, and after muttering "brr" to Adrian, Dardanius showed the group a flip book of his ideas. Chris gasped in delight at one of the options, a white suit and gown covered in swirls of rose quartz gemstones. Alexander gagged at the designs from behind Chris, although when she looked behind her to identify the source of the gagging noise, he hastily coughed and looked away. However, in order to not be scolded by Adrian for being disagreeable, he went along with the proposed outfits. Dardanius dressed the pair in the rose quartz costumes and sent them down to the parade area, where they were rather early and decided to mingle with the other tributes. Chris chatted with Lilia from 2, and the girls got along quite well after discovering they both hated their district partners. Alexander seemed to get along well with Felix from 2, who was also quite displeased with their parade costumes, which had them dressed to look like large blocks of stone. These 2 pairs of careers made small talk as they waited for the parade, standing around and fidgeting with their accessories. At last, all tributes were told to board their chariots and prepare for the parade to begin. At the District 1 chariot, Alexander stepped up and grudgingly offered his hand to Chris to assist her in getting up. However, she refused to take it despite her long and flowing dress, and stubbornly insisted on stepping up herself. This did not end well for Chris, as a moment later she was flat on her bottom after falling off the chariot. Brushing her dress off with the help of a sympathetic Lilia, Chris succeeded in climbing into the chariot by herself the second time. Alexander had been watching her with a skeptical eye during this time, although Rosalia noted in post-games commentary that a worried look had briefly crossed his face when she fell down the first time. The parade commenced without further incidents, as many tributes this year performed a generic smile and wave during the event. Alexander and Chris appeared to be in physical pain at having to hold hands, but once again they seemed to go with the philosophy of grin and bear it throughout the parade. District 9 won Rosalia's best dress this year with their windmill-inspired costumes that Rosalia declared were a clever reference by their stylist to the 102nd Games, while still maintaining the district's industry. Chris became upset upon hearing that District 1 did not win, but Alexander seemed privately relieved that the capital did not have the same taste in fashion as his ex-fiancée. Adrian congratulated his tributes for their performance, though he scolded Chris for complaining about not winning Best Dressed, and reminded her that there were many more important factors that would win them sponsors in the arena. Alexander seemed smug about the fact that their mentor had just scolded her, casually sipping from a glass of iced tea in the background and smiling serenely over the rim of his cup, while Adrian berated her. As Chris noticed this, she scowled in response before slamming her door and going to bed in a huff. As Alexander stared after her with a confused expression, seemingly wondering why she was so offended, Adrian pursed his lips and reminded him that he was not going to solve anything or make their situation better by treating Chris as the enemy when she would have to be his teammate for most of the games. When Alexander began to protest and insisted he could always find other allies, Adrian turned to him seriously and replied, "But they won't be her," pointing a finger at the door to his district partner's room. Lowering his voice, Adrian added that in his opinion, he believed Chris still felt for Alexander. However, Alexander stiffened and replied that this was clearly untrue, as he did not know the context of the breaking off of their engagement. Adrian shrugged and simply continued by stating that no matter how many other tributes he allied with in the arena, none of them would contain the same emotional attachment to him as she did, asking if he could truly kill her if it came down to that. A stony-faced Alexander began to reply, but Adrian put a finger to his lips and stated, "It was a rhetorical question," before sauntering out of the apartment and bidding him good night. All tributes were woken up bright and early the next morning for training, with their mentors whipping them into shape with healthy meals and short exercise routines before it was time to head down to the training center. Many were exhausted by their grueling schedules and trudged down to the training center as if they were marching to the gallows, a comparison drawn by Rosalia that she realized immediately was rather ironic. As the tributes streamed into the training center to begin their 3 days of games training, Gloria Steele arrived once again to greet the tributes and explain the rules, warning them sharply about funny business, and firing a warning shot into the air with her water cannon. Only minutes after the tributes had been released to the stations, a large 5-way brawl broke out at the sword station. Felix, Constantine from 6, Hessian from 8, Randall from 10, and Alder from 11 had all reached for the same sword at the same time and had begun to throw punches over it, declaring that it was the best-looking sword out of all of those in the station. Most tributes peered in curiosity at the sight, warily staying out of the action but quietly placing bets amongst themselves as to who would come out on top. Peacekeepers burst into the fray and quickly wrestled apart the combatants before the fight could escalate. Gloria Steele came running in a moment later, furiously berating the tributes involved, and firing her water cannon at each of the offenders, which necessitated that a trainer retrieve a wet floor sign from a supply closet to mark off the soaked area of the floor. Once everyone in the fight had been subdued, Gloria warned the tributes that any further conflicts would be severely punished. Chris and Lelia berated Felix for getting involved, although there was not much he could do or say to retaliate because he was lying on the ground, having been water cannoned. Alexander stayed out of this argument and instead casually chatted with Stream from 4, who had been watching the chaos unfold from the safety of the Trident station nearby. The two boys struck up an acquaintance, with Stream admitting that he was a bit intimidated by his muscular district partner, Brooklet, but that Alexander seemed nice enough to him. The boys offered to exchange lessons in various skills with each other in order to improve themselves overall. The boy from 4 taught Alexander how to weave baskets and make complex fisherman's knots at the hammock-making and knot stations, while Alexander instructed him in hand-to-hand combat and swords at those respective stations after the chaos died down. In the meantime, Chris and Lelia worked closely together during the training period, dragging Felix along with them even as it was clear he would have preferred to be working with Alexander. The girls enjoyed the knives station the most, comparing the shininess of the knives they chose and taking turns hurling them into targets. Indeed, by the end of the 3rd day, Felix appeared like a tired father with his children at the amusement park, according to Rosalia. At the conclusion of the training period, the tributes were asked to demonstrate their skills for the game makers in their private sessions. Alexander was the first tribute to perform, and he allegedly appeared slightly nervous in front of the expectant game makers when arriving in the room. The Capitol had completely given up at this point on restricting the flow of information about each tribute's private evaluation session, to the point where it was not even regulated anymore. Alexander asked for a holographic projection machine to be brought out, which was done at once by a pair of AVOXes. The machine began firing out holograms of tributes as if they were preparing to attack him. Alexander seized a sword from the weapons rack and brandished it, slashing and hacking his way through the holograms like a knife through butter, and with a practiced, easy grace. The game makers were quite impressed by this display and gave him nods of approval throughout this session. He only faltered once near the end, when a hologram that Gossip magazines remarked looked similar to Chris got close enough to graze his arm, but he quickly twisted and sliced through its neck without hesitation before nodding to the game makers and exiting. Chris was brought in next, where she gave a winsome smile to the team of game makers and turned to the knife-throwing targets. Pulling over the weapons rack, Chris selected a large basket of throwing knives and fanned out several in her hands before whipping around and hurling them in a rapid succession of silver blurs. Once she had emptied the basket of knives, Chris turned around and displayed her work. The knives had been thrown to make the outline of a delicate rose in the center of the target, impressing the game makers as they gave Chris a polite round of applause and marked down their individual notes. Once the rest of the tributes had been given a chance to show off their abilities, the training scores were released. Leading the pack this year were Felix and Lelia from 2, tied with Alexander and Chris from 1, with a training score of 10. Right behind them were Stream and Brooklet from 4 with a score of 9, as well as Randall from 10 and Alder from 11 with scores of 8 each. Zeta from 3 was at the bottom with a mere 2. Adrian was quite pleased with his tribute scores, but stated that he expected nothing less from such a skilled district. Rosalia Sanchez arrived at Capitol Studios to conduct the interviews the following evening in a floral patterned dress, with its layers separated by winding dark green ribbons. After briefly bantering with the crowd and welcoming them to the interviews for the 104th Hunger Games, she welcomed Chris to the stage. Chris emerged from backstage in a stunning green gown studded with peridot to match her eyes, and Rosalia immediately commented that she looked like a princess in the elegant dress. Chris laughed charmingly and responded that she was just trying to look her best for the occasion, especially if it would be the last time she ever got to dress up. This statement instantly provoked sympathetic sounds from the Capitol audience, who shuddered to think what might happen if they could never dress up again. Rosalia continued to have a sociable chat with Chris before asking her the fatal question about her past relationship and engagement to her district partner. Chris seemed to deflate a bit upon hearing this, and primly stated that while it was unfortunate she and Alexander had gone separate paths, she hoped they could talk out their issues before, if not during, the games. Rosalia sensed that pressing the issue would just lead to an uncomfortable moment, so she thanked Chris for her time and allowed her to exit the stage. Rosalia then invited Alexander up to join her on stage. Dressed in a dark emerald suit, he waved politely to the crowd and laughed as a bouquet of flowers was thrown at his feet before sniffing them good-naturedly. Rosalia invited him to talk about his plans for the games and how he wanted to approach them. Alexander replied that he was going to try to forge strong alliances and remain loyal, wishing to have fair and honorable fights with the best tribute winning. This garnered respectful applause from the gathered crowd. They continued to chat seriously for several more minutes before Rosalia closed in on the question many Capitol citizens had been wondering, if Alexander would work with Chris in the games despite their engagement gone wrong. He set his mouth in a thin line as he heard this question, and dryly responded that he would work with her if he had to, although he did not have anything to say to her anymore. Many audience members winced from second-hand embarrassment, with Rosalia mock-shivering to indicate the chilly response. The interview wrapped up soon afterward, Alexander having become withdrawn and cool since the notorious question was asked. The pair from one stalked off to their rooms as soon as they returned from the interviews, both in an equally foul mood. Adrian face-palmed as his tributes slammed their doors on each other and exchanged a weary look with the nearby Avoxes, popping an aspirin into his mouth and heading over to knock on Chris's door. A muffled call of acknowledgement sounded from within, and he headed inside to talk with her. Cameras inside the room captured Chris curled in the fetal position, golden hair spilling over a pillow she was clutching to her chest as she stared blankly out the window, still in her bulky interview dress. Adrian gently seated himself in the armchair in the corner, asking her how she was feeling and if there was any way he could help. Chris slowly turned, her eyes glinting in the faint glow of the technology in the room, grumpily asking how he thought she felt after the disastrous interviews. Adrian inclined his head and stated that they had not been that bad, and that she seemed to be internalizing it too much. She snorted into the pillow and buried her face in it as Adrian remarked that she would ruin her makeup by doing this. Chris groaned and interjected that no one was there to see it anyway, though he reminded her a moment later that there were cameras in the room and that all of Panem could in fact see it. She grumbled in response and demanded to know why he had entered in the first place, if not to insult her and make her feel worse about the evening's events. Adrian replied that he wanted to speak to her about Alexander, though she stiffened at the mention of this name and muttered that whatever he had to say, she did not want to hear it. He raised an eyebrow and quietly asked if she truly did not want to hear it, or if she was telling herself this to avoid recognizing that she needed to hear it. Chris threw a smaller pillow at him and complained that he was being too philosophical for this time of night, though it appeared as though she was tentatively listening as he told her that they were both being difficult, trying to avoid each other and ignore the problem rather than talking it out. Adrian then proposed that she find a time to speak with Alexander before the games to clear the air. Chris burst into a series of protests, but they went unheard as Adrian stood up and left the room, with his final words lingering in the air, that reconciling in this situation was a matter of life and death. He then stepped across the hall and quietly knocked on Alexander's door, before being admitted a moment later to find the boy sitting on the floor near the window and staring out at the glittering storefronts in the shopping center near the accommodations quarters. Alexander sighed as he entered, patting a spot across from him, where Adrian obligingly settled himself. Several minutes of silence passed before Alexander spoke, asking his mentor if he wished to know the context behind his complicated relationship with Chris. Adrian nodded carefully, stating that he had all the time in the world, though he appeared to regret this a moment later when Alexander muttered that while Adrian might have had plenty of time, he himself did not. Despite this, he reluctantly explained to Adrian that he had been close childhood friends with Chris, and that they had done nearly everything together, even participating in their first luxury jewelry photo shoot together. Therefore, it had felt natural for them when they matured into their teenage years and dated from the age of 14, building up a strong trust on a foundation of shared childhood memories and the shared experiences as members of District 1's elite training academy. Alexander had known for years that he would one day propose marriage to Chris, which he had done just a couple of months before the reaping in the center square of their district, with a beautiful emerald ring to match her eyes. The pair had been overjoyed to celebrate their engagement and prepare for marriage, but they still had a few months left of their formal education before they would be able to get jobs and fund a wedding. At the end of year school dance, the pair had been about to attend an after-party held by Alexander's good friend, Zoisite Brown, when he had received a message that his mother had fallen down a flight of stairs while at a family friend's house and needed medical attention. Alexander had excused himself from the party and promised to meet their friends again when the situation was handled, encouraging Chris to go to the after-party without him. Once his mother was safely housed in the district's medical center and in a stable condition, he returned to Zoisite's house and opened the door, only to find Zoisite and Chris locked in a passionate embrace. Storming away in agony as Chris frantically chased behind him in a half-dressed state, he had immediately broken off the engagement, though he declined to explain the situation to his family or other friends and had severed his ties with Zoisite and Chris. Since that time, he had kept his head down and worked as a bookkeeper for a ruby mine in the district. Adrian sat and listened attentively to the story, occasionally inclining his head or making a grunt of acknowledgement, pausing a moment at the conclusion of the story before speaking. He asked Alexander if he had ever had any interactions with Chris from that moment on, to which the boy furiously shook his head. Adrian then asked if he believed in forgiveness, and he replied irritably that he did believe in forgiveness, but did not believe in forgetting. Another moment of silence passed, broken by Adrian shrugging and standing up to leave. Alexander became angry and demanded to know why he was leaving, as he was a mentor and giving advice was his job. Adrian shrugged and responded that he could only give advice to those who were willing to accept it, bidding Alexander a good night and exiting the room. Inside his room, Alexander placed his hands on top of his head and exhaled sharply, pacing around for several more minutes. Soon, it was evident that he could not tolerate being in the confines of his room and slipped out to the balcony for some fresh air. As he breathed in the crisp evening air and yawned loudly, he heard a gasp from in front of him and opened his eyes, shocked. Chris had also been standing in her interview gown and looking out at the cityscape, though she was almost obscured from behind by a potted plant. Her eyes grew wide with fear, and she skittered back towards the door, but Alexander caught her by the arm. At once, she appeared afraid that he was about to strike her, yet he quickly released her arm and patted the sofa cushions to indicate he wished for them to sit down and talk. Apprehensively, Chris perched on the edge nearest the door, almost as if creating an escape route for herself. Alexander settled nearby and pressed a button on the table to ring an Avox. As one of their Avoxes appeared in the doorway, he asked for 2 glasses of champagne, which were provided to them within a minute. The pair carefully sipped from their glasses as the silence stretched on for several seconds, only punctuated by the swishing of the drinks. Suddenly, both of the tributes started to talk at the same time, flushing bright red and then hurriedly apologizing in unison to each other before insisting that the other go first. Chris reluctantly agreed to go first, admitting that while she could not excuse her own past actions, Adrian had helped her realize that the only way to truly deal with them was by talking out their issues. Alexander offered a guarded nod and allowed her to continue without interruption. Chris continued by explaining that while there was nothing she could say that would undo the hurt caused by her behavior, she had been extremely drunk at the time of the incident and had only realized what had happened the following morning, having felt horrible but too guilty to even attempt to contact him. He raised an eyebrow as she kept talking. Chris promised that she had not drank any alcohol at all since that night until now, admitting that it gave her extreme guilt to even look at it. Earnestly raising her head so that her face was illuminated in the soft balcony lights, she quietly apologized. Alexander sat across from her with an impassive expression for a long time before replying to fracture the silence that he forgave her, as long as she recognized the pain that she had inflicted upon him that night. She nodded, tears forming in her eyes, and declared that it felt like a burden had been lifted to have finally had this conversation. Hesitantly, Alexander reached across and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, a few tears spilling from his own eyes as he took in her face directly for the first time in months. He quietly admitted that he missed being close with her, regardless of the nature of their relationship, and hoped they could be again. She nodded happily, only for her face to cloud over as she reminded him about the games and worried about how they might survive together. After a somber moment of thought, he suggested that they continue to pretend that they still despised each other to lower their threat level, while actually working together in the meantime. Chris's eyes lit up at the plan, and she declared it genius, stating that what the twos didn't know couldn't hurt them. Even the stony-faced Alexander laughed a little bit at this statement, and admitted it would be entertaining to do some method acting. The pair suddenly jumped in surprise as they heard a faint noise from the balcony of the District 2 apartment above them and agreed it would be a good time to head back in and go to bed. Chris offered Alexander a hug before they returned to their rooms, but he scratched the back of his neck awkwardly and explained he did not feel quite ready to take this step yet. She nodded in understanding and instead offered a handshake, yanking his hand up and down as she grinned and scampered back into the apartment. Alexander shook his head as if to process the events that had just occurred, though a tiny smile crossed his face as it appeared he had gained a renewed hope for success in the arena. An intrigued Rosalia Sanchez speculated aloud in her late-night program if they had only had this conversation because it was likely they could both die within the next few days, wondering if they would have ever talked to each other again outside of the games or remained bitter for the rest of their lives. After a peaceful night for the pair from one, and a restless one for most of the other tributes, the pairs from each district were marched down to the launch room to be transported into the arena. The outfits for this year's arena were seen to be plain green t-shirts, khaki pants, and worn boots. Adrian reminded both Alexander and Chris that there were now bigger issues at stake than hurt feelings, and that they would need to get over their aversion to each other to succeed in the games, though he had not heard their conversation on the balcony, and they each offered him small smiles in return. Each tribute stepped into his or her tube, quietly bracing themselves, and they slowly rose up as the countdown commenced. The tributes gazed around in open-mouthed shock at this year's arena, the Garden of Earthly Delights. A tall, ivory urn stood in the center and served as the cornucopia, overflowing with a much larger supply of weapons than normal. In addition, weapons were scattered all around the flower beds near the cornucopia, where the tributes' podiums were positioned. The arena appeared to be in a state of perpetual sunset, even though it was only early afternoon, and many tributes noted some faint hissing noises emanating from all around them. An unusual number of tributes this year eyed up various weapons around the cornucopia, evidently believing they could slip in and grab one without others noticing due to the large quantity of weapons in the cornucopia area. As the gong sounded, nearly every single tribute ran towards the cornucopia. Rosalia gasped at this strange phenomenon and declared that it would be all the rage to discuss in post-games commentary. The only 3 tributes who ran away were Constantine from 6, Cordura from 8, and Ariel from 15. From the moment that so many tributes decided to run inward for a chance of gaining some supplies in the surreal arena, the bloodbath was transformed from a regular occurrence into complete chaos. The wide variety of weapons offered in the cornucopia area catered to many tributes' strengths, allowing them to engage in bloody and brutal fights. The career tributes all ran in, although they were forced to scatter by a brawl occurring in the central region near the urn. Alder from 11 quickly reached a supply of axes and ripped one through the neck of the girl from 5, decapitating her on the spot. Behind him, Brooklet from 4 grabbed a trident and rammed it into the side of the girl from 10, puncturing her lung and killing her within moments. Alexander and Felix fought back to back, warding off tributes with their weapons. Alexander had picked up a pair of swords and was dual-wielding, while Felix had managed to obtain a longsword and swung it at the boy from 3, killing him. Chris and Lilia acted as a well-oiled machine, firing scores of knives into the hearts of the boy from 15 and the girl from 9, respectively. The boy from 7 charged at the girls with an axe but was tackled to the side and was brutally stabbed to death by Alexander with his dual swords. Chris breathlessly turned to thank Alexander, though he feigned ignoring her while throwing her a tiny wink, and continued fighting on behalf of himself and Felix. Behind them, Stream from 4 seized several ropes and lashed them at Artemisia from 11, tripping her before running in and strangling her. Alexander and Felix turned away from the difficult effort they had just made of pinning the muscular girl from 7 and slashing her neck, panting heavily as they watched the action continuing around them. Brooklet continued to be a force of destruction with her trident, cutting down Zeta from 3 and the boy from 5 in the same sweep as their cannons sounded. Alexander looked over his shoulder at Stream, who was strangling a struggling Hessian from 8, and apologized under his breath before diving at Brooklet from behind and pinning her to the ground. She cried out in surprise and fury, wriggling to get up and flailing her trident around, but Felix hurried over and piled on by tugging at her trident with a free hand and distracting her. Alexander used the help from his ally to take one of his swords and plunge it into her back, causing Brooklet to let out an anguished scream and go limp. They turned her over, blood pooling around her body, as he swiftly finished off the girl with his swords. Alexander looked up to see a deeply hurt Stream glowering at him for killing his district partner. However, there was no time to waste, as Chris screamed upon seeing Lelia tackled by Alder from the side. Before he could impale her with his axe, Chris hurled a knife into his shoulder at close range, running forward as he stumbled back and loosened his grip on her ally. Together with Lelia, she seized the knife from his shoulder and they stabbed him repeatedly in the face and neck until he slowly bled out and expired. At this point, the bloodbath action was beginning to die down, the cornucopia area littered with bodies. Felix managed to run up behind a retreating Kodo from 9 and brutally impaled him with his longsword. Soon, the tributes at the cornucopia slowly thinned out, all except for the careers and 2 stragglers, Stream from 4 and Sophia from 6. Lelia viciously sprinted towards Sophia and tackled her into a flower bed, calling for backup. Chris hurried after her, footsteps pounding on the stone path, and charged forward with 2 knives to assist Lelia in pushing the crying Sophia to the ground and slitting her throat. Chris appeared sympathetic for a moment as she looked down at the tears drying on Sophia's pale face, but checked herself a second later and resumed a neutral expression. The girls turned to attack the other remaining tribute, eyes darting around. Instead of allowing the girls to take care of the straggler, though, Alexander called out to them from across the cornucopia area and told them to let him go, nodding to Stream as he turned around. Lelia frowned and gestured at Alexander with her knife, demanding to know why they could not kill Stream, but he simply looked away and said that they needed to conserve their energy for later. He pointed out that there had been no food or water in the cornucopia and that they needed to find some nourishment before they burnt themselves out. Lelia reluctantly lowered her knife and agreed, but Chris rolled her eyes as Alexander allowed Stream to escape the cornucopia area behind him. She stormed up to her ex-fiancé and asked him why he was being this nice to random other tributes all of a sudden, when he could not even muster the courage to talk to her, though her voice noticeably lifted up at the end of this sentence as if she were trying not to laugh. Alexander scowled and replied that he would have talked to her if she had a better attitude, prompting Chris to reel back as if she were about to slap him. Felix separated the 2 right away, reminding them that they needed to focus on finding food and not arguing. When the 2's backs were turned, the pair from 1 exchanged a sly grin. 15 cannons rang out over the course of the next several minutes as the careers explored the area south of the cornucopia, causing a major stir in the capital, as Rosalia commented that this was the largest bloodbath yet. Chris counted the cannons off on her hands, noting to their surprise that there were now only 9 tributes remaining, including themselves. Without a changing sky to reflect the time of day, the tributes had to rely on the capital to tell them the time, via the evening anthem and the portraits of the dead in the sky. The faces of both tributes from 3, Brooklet from 4, both tributes from 5, Sophia from 6, both tributes from 7, Hessian from 8, both tributes from 9, the girl from 10, both tributes from 11, and the boy from 15 were shown in the sky to those still alive. Among the 9 remaining tributes were Alexander and Chris from 1, Felix and Lelia from 2, Stream from 4, Constantine from 6, Cordura from 8, Randall from 10, and Ariel from 15. Camped out in a soft and grassy field, the career tributes snacked on the contents of several silver parachutes. The pair from 1's pre-games pandering and the 2's training scores had earned the group several sponsored packages of food and water, which they divided up eagerly. Alexander shared a whole roast chicken with Felix, while Chris and Lelia enjoyed a sumptuous lamb stew. Felix and Lelia carried the conversation during dinner, with Alexander and Chris only responding or contributing when they were directly asked a question. Once again, they refused to look at each other, only sharing the occasional glance to reassure each other when their allies were not paying attention. Despite the fact that night never fell on this arena, Felix declared himself to be too tired to take first watch for the evening and asked if someone else would watch in his place. Lelia agreed, remarking that the lamb stew had worn her out and suggested rather slyly that Alexander and Chris take the first watch together. Both immediately protested, Alexander even saying that he would rather guard by himself, but Lelia fixed them with a stern look and reminded them that there needed to be 2 guards to keep everyone accountable and avoid having one ally slaughter the rest in their sleep to get ahead. Lelia would not take no for an answer in spite of the pair's strong protests, and headed further over in the field to settle down for the night next to her district partner, wiggling her knife at the pair and making a show of holding it in her hand as she went to sleep to avoid any ambushing. As soon as they heard the loud snores of their allies, the pair burst into peals of laughter and recounted the most amusing moments from the day so far, before launching into an animated discussion about the low number of tributes remaining. Instead of staying on guard at their camp, they decided to take a walk around the arena to gain a better understanding of their surroundings. Chris debated waking up Lelia to join them and abandoning Felix, who was a strong and hostile threat, but Alexander reminded her that she would quickly discover their deception if they did this. She nodded reluctantly and they continued on, commenting about the eerie nature of the perpetual sunset in the arena. The winding stone paths swirled in different directions past the central stone urn, one path leading to the left past their alliance camp and into a small ditch containing a pool and some fruit trees. The path on the right led one through a patch of brilliantly colored, almost artificial-looking flowering bushes in shades of velvety purples, rich fuchsias, and alluring blues. The central path cut between two tall rows of trees, though what lay beyond them was unclear. After huddling for a moment, the pair decided to take the central path, deeming it the least dangerous and containing the most opportunity. As they passed through the whispering trees, a sweet aroma of lavender and patchouli floated by, causing Alexander to close his eyes in a reverie. He commented that it smelled like wedding flowers and asked Chris if she remembered attending his cousin's wedding with him, to which she grinned and reminded him of the antics they had gotten up to at this time. Alexander laughed at first and recalled how she had accidentally bowled over a flower girl in her eagerness to be at the front of the dessert line, resulting in her playfully slapping him and complaining that the girl had quickly recovered anyway. As they continued through the trees and emerged into a clearing, they were shocked to find Stream, the boy from 4 whom Alexander had worked with earlier, slumped against a beautiful tree in the center, which appeared to be encircled by a sparkling creek. In his hand was a ruby-red apple with a singular bite taken from it. The pair from 1 exchanged confused glances and approached the scene cautiously, as they had certainly not heard a cannon since the bloodbath, and therefore he had to still be alive at this time. Chris got close enough to nudge him with her foot, both tributes holding their weapons of choice at the ready. For a moment, nothing happened, until Alexander observed something moving near the boy's neck. He pointed this out to Chris, and they peered closer at him, trying to make out the outline of his neck in the sunset glow. Suddenly, to their revulsion, they realized a laceration had been made by someone or something in the boy's neck, and a small snake slithered through it and out onto the grass. Alexander appeared about ready to vomit, disgusted by the sight, while Chris let out a shriek and tripped backward, falling on her bottom in terror. To clarify to viewers around Panem what had happened, Rosalia aired the footage from an hour prior to this, in which Stream had approached the grove nearly delirious with hunger and thirst. After drinking heavily from the clear creek to satiate his thirst, he cast around for something to eat, only to find the plump, ripe apple dangling slightly above his head on the tree. Severing its stem with a snap, he had blissfully bitten into the apple, savoring the first bite with great relief. However, Stream's hunger and thirst had blinded him to the fact that this apple was actually a game-maker trap. Within seconds of taking this first bite of the apple, he had been surrounded by a chorus of undulating hissing and could hardly even cry out before he was attacked by a swarm of lethal snakes. Yet it was not until now that he had fully bled out, and his cannon sounded just a moment after the pair from 1 discovered the snake slithering around him. As his body was removed from the grove, Alexander helped Chris back up, and she self-consciously dusted her bottom for dirt stains, joking that if she was going to die in the arena, she would rather do so without dirty pants. To their surprise, though groups of trees expanded outward from the clearing in patches, the arena seemed to be very small, and the pair found that they did not have much else to explore beyond the grove. On their return trip to the career camp, they tried to distract themselves from the scarring incidents of seeing Stream's body by telling anecdotes from the pre-games period and their recent lives. Rosalia noted that they seemed like 2 peas in a pod, and slyly remarked to an intern that she hoped they would get intimate. When at last they arrived back at their camp and heard Felix and Lilia stirring to wake up for their shift, they made sure they were seen curling up to sleep as far away from each other as possible. As morning dawned, another cannon sounded in the arena. Viewers around Panem witnessed this death to be that of Constantine, who had found a small patch at the western end filled with brightly colored mushrooms. Constantine had become intrigued by these mushrooms, and having not eaten anything else since the start of the games the prior day, had placed one on the tip of his tongue. He proceeded to quickly devour mushroom after mushroom from the patch without restraint, before collapsing in a content daze. At this point, Constantine appeared to be experiencing hallucinations, foaming in the mouth, crawling around on all fours, and apparently believing he had become a tiger. After several minutes of this spectacle, Constantine decided that he would put his new tiger skills to use and attempted to climb a tree. He scaled the tree with remarkable agility and soon reached the top. However, considering Constantine did not really have the grace and agility of a tiger, as he was a human, he quickly overbalanced the fragile treetop and slid down several feet in a panic before falling to his death. The rest of the day passed without incident for most tributes, save for the cannon of Ariel from 15, who had succumbed to a severe allergic reaction after being stung by a bee in the eastern area of the arena. At the career camp, Alexander and Chris had been stiffly ignoring each other for most of the day, with Rosalia remarking that they seemed like poorly crafted marionettes when trying to act irritated around each other in front of Felix and Lilia. The The couriers continued to pick away at their sponsored food supply while occasionally making conversation about the fact that there were so few people left and it was only the second day. Lelia worried aloud that the games might have their showdown before the next day even began, a sentiment echoed by Chris and Alexander. The group noticed a few decent-sized snakes wiggling around in the grassy field, although Felix prodded one with his toe and it did not seem interested in attacking the group. As they settled down to take turns on guard duty for the night, they failed to notice a small figure perched on a lower branch of a tree near their field. This was identified to be Cordura from 8, who was keenly watching and observing the group. Thin and clearly fatigued from a lack of food, as she did not appear to trust the bright and seemingly appetizing fruits in the arena, she hungrily eyed their supply of sponsored food. However, she appeared rightfully concerned about the pack of 4 people with weapons roaming the area near these food supplies, and looked around for opportunities to distract them. At last, she seized upon a nearby tree branch. Observing that Felix had laid down a few feet away from her tree without noticing her presence, she dangled the branch down at his slumbering form and tickled his nose. Felix snorted awake in confusion, and his eyes rested upon the person closest to him, Chris, as the culprit. Scowling, he demanded to know why Chris was disrupting his beauty sleep, but she waved her hands in a confused manner and replied that she had not tickled him. He turned to Alexander and Lelia, but neither could offer an explanation, and in fact Lelia suggested he might have eaten a suspicious mushroom to be experiencing such illusions. Felix did not take kindly to this comment from his district partner at all. He began to bicker with Lelia, insisting she had pulled a prank because she did not like him. Lelia retorted that she would not pull this kind of immature prank no matter how much she liked or disliked him, and the pair continued to argue as Cordura shimmied down the branch to see if she could leap down behind the group and make off with some food without anyone seeing. However, Cordura was not so lucky as to go unseen. Standing and watching the spectacle unfolding in front of them, Alexander and Chris raised their eyebrows, having spotted her small frame on the tree branch. Glancing at each other out of the corner of their eyes without moving from their places, they seemed to communicate silently to each other as to their next course of action. Cordura unsuspectingly crawled down the branch, hoping to drop right behind the pair from one and make off with their supplies. The moment her feet touched the ground, Alexander and Chris whipped around in unison and charged at her, knocking her into the grass. At this time, the pair realized to their frustration that their weapons were still lying halfway down the hill in a pile with those of Felix and Lelia. Chris continued to pin the struggling Cordura down as Alexander cast around for a weapon. When he could find none within range, he picked up the closest things he could find, 2 large, wriggling snakes. Shrugging at a grimacing Chris, who was still fighting to hold Cordura down, Alexander knocked the snakes' heads together as if he were pistol whipping them against each other to stun them. As Chris moved to the side, he winced and dug the snake's teeth downward deep into her neck. Both ones looked away as Cordura shrieked in agony and blood spilled from the wounds. They moved away from her to allow her some privacy, but they were by no means surprised shortly afterward when a cannon sounded and they heard the whirring of a hovercraft. Behind them, Felix and Lelia had continued to argue and had completely missed the entire scene that had just unfolded nearby. The argument seemed to have escalated, and Alexander and Chris hurried over to defuse the situation. At this point, Felix had grabbed his longsword and was brandishing it at Lelia, his threat quite apparent. Lelia jabbed the knife in his general direction in response, glaring. Chris attempted to steer her friend away from the conflict, but she was pushed aside as Lelia moved to confront Felix with her hands on her hips. The next moment happened almost too quickly for anyone to comprehend. As Lelia stood her ground amid her allies pleading to drop it, about to give Felix a piece of her mind, he became fed up and had clearly had enough of the argument. With no time to waste, he ran his own district partner through the stomach with his long sword. Lelia screamed in alarm and surprise, looking down in horror at the sword protruding out of her stomach. She grew pale within seconds, as the strike had severed a crucial vein, and fell to the ground. Chris shrieked and began to weep, frustrated with Felix for doing such a thing to his own district partner and her close ally. She tried to tear off scraps of her shirt to make a compress for Lelia's wounds, but it was clearly too late, and the girl had lost a large amount of blood already. When the hovercraft arrived to collect Lelia's body, Felix turned to Alexander and Chris, who demanded an explanation for his rash actions when there were still more tributes out there to track down and kill. He shrugged in response and said he would have had to kill Lelia at some point, and that he did not like her much anyway. While this clearly offended Chris, who had been fond of Lelia, he got into their good graces once more by agreeing to stay with them until they could kill the last remaining tribute. After an uncomfortable night of rest, the trio collected their remaining supplies and headed inward past the cornucopia, passing through the deceptively beautiful grove once more. When Felix's back was turned, Alexander indicated to Chris in a low whisper that he had probably killed Lelia to suck up to them, believing that they would rather fight him at the end than each other, due to resentment from their past engagement and wanting to see the other die more than they wanted Felix dead. Chris grinned at the incorrectness of this perception, but carefully hid her smile a moment later when Felix turned around suspiciously upon hearing their whispering. The group continued to look around the arena for their final competitor, eyes shifting carefully around. At one point, Felix asked if they might have been followed, but Chris dismissed this possibility and remarked that she was quite observant and would have heard or seen this. Yet the group finally struck gold after another hour of searching when they stumbled upon a grouping of trees, a decidedly human figure crouching in one of them. The careers appeared confused by the lack of movement from the figure, with Alexander muttering that it could be a trap. As they approached, the trio held out their weapons and cautiously peered at the figure. They could not see well through the foliage, but they could tell it was Randall from 10. He turned around at the noise as his eyes glinted darkly, sensing the incoming tributes. Felix casually walked ahead of the ones as he was impatient to see what was happening, but Alexander and Chris stayed back with guarded expressions. Randall crouched in the bushes as his eyes followed them from the shadows. Suddenly, he leaped out of the bushes and charged at the group, growling in guttural tones. He swatted Felix and Chris aside like bowling pins and slammed Alexander back onto the ground, knocking the wind out of him before attempting to shove a cluster of small purple berries that Rosalia identified as nightlock into Alexander's mouth. Felix, who had been sideswiped into a tangled bush, could only watch from the ground as Alexander writhed and defiantly closed his mouth to prevent the rabid Randall from shoving the berries in. The boys grunted and struggled, rolling around on the ground. All of Panem watched in excitement as Randall finally managed to wrench Alexander's mouth open with his fingers, panting and wheezing, eyes glazed over. Many viewers winced as he lowered the berries to Alexander's lips before he paled, choked, and fell backward. Cameras zoomed out to reveal Chris standing behind Randall, a knife protruding from his back. Gritting her teeth, she ran forward, dragged the knife out, and stabbed it again into his head, breathing heavily from the exertion as he fell forward and his cannon sounded a moment later. Covered in Randall's blood, Alexander and Chris slowly looked over at Felix, who was staring at them in fury. Struggling to a standing position and waving his longsword to emphasize his words, his voice shook with anger. He declared his mentor, Celia Barrett, to have been correct when she had told her mentees that she had been standing out on the District 2 balcony to get some fresh air the night before the games and had thought she overheard a conversation between the pair about trying to dupe the pair from 2 by pretending that they were not working together. He grinned darkly as Alexander and Chris exchanged shocked, worried looks. Felix casually twirled his sword in his hand despite his injuries and admitted that he had always wanted to try killing both ones at once since his days at the training academy and believed it would bring honor to himself and his district, stating that this was why he had waited until the final 3 to expose his knowledge of their conversation. Chris tossed her hair and placed her hands on her hips, skeptically asking why he had killed Lelia if he wanted to overpower them first. He waved his free hand dismissively and commented that she was an annoyance anyway, which caused Chris's nostrils to flare in indignation as she took a step forward, thrusting out her knife in a threatening manner and growling that Lelia had never done anything to hurt him. Just as it appeared that these two were about to break into a fight, Alexander reached out to place a hand on Chris's shoulder, and she softened at this touch, retreating as they both raised their weapons at the boy from 2. Felix glared at them and leveraged his sword at each of them in turn. Chris continued to clench her knife in her hand, tensing, while Alexander had picked up his sword from the ground and was cautiously looking over at their furious ally. The boy from 2 blanched as they moved toward him in unison, raising their weapons. The 3 engaged in a heated clash, but after a brutal and exhausting struggle, Felix fell to the combined blows of Alexander's sword and Chris's knife. As a hovercraft arrived to collect his body and his cannon sounded, the pair slowly turned to each other, illuminated in the faint sunset light. The arena had been abuzz up until this point with the sounds of rustling leaves, slithering snakes, and buzzing insects, but at this time many viewers noted that everything seemed to quiet down in this emotionally charged moment between the final 2. They stepped away from each other and stared at the ground, still breathing heavily from the effort of killing Felix while being covered in his and Randall's blood. Chris was the first to look up, eyes rimmed with red, weakly raising her knife and looking uncertain for the first time since the games had begun. Alexander glanced up once he realized she was looking at him, but he appeared grim and tense. To relieve some of the awkwardness lingering in the air, he shrugged his shoulders slightly and remarked that this clearing would have been lovely for a picnic if they did not have to kill each other. Chris laughed weakly and remarked that she was surprised that this games had been so short, commenting that it felt like a lifetime, though she did not echo his sentiment of feeling the need to kill each other. Alexander offered a small smile and ran his hand through his hair, quietly agreeing. Suddenly, Chris began to shake with emotion, curling her fists before running forward and half-heartedly swinging her knife at Alexander. He leaped aside at the last second and she flew past him, throwing out her arms to stop her momentum and lurching forward. She turned back to him with a desperate look as if asking to not make it too difficult on her, cheeks streaked with dirt, dry crusted blood, and tears, but he continued to stand somberly on the path behind her. She exhaled sharply in exasperation and ran back at him again, this time as if being dragged along by a puppet string. However, this time Alexander dropped his sword and caught her wrist in his hand as he had done once before, lowering it and the knife with little resistance. Chris raised her other hand to strike, but he caught it again, although he let this hand go, and Chris rested it on his shoulder as if they were engaging in a slow dance. To the surprise and delight of the capital, the pair stared into each other's eyes intensely for a moment, exchanging quiet apologies and the tiniest of sad smiles before initiating what Rosalia could only describe as a tango to the death. They began to strike blows at each other while drawn together, as if dancing, with Chris trying to find a free place to land her knife and Alexander blocking each of her kicks and punches with a practiced flow. With Chris's legs slashing through the air and Alexander dipping her to avoid being hit by her knife, it appeared as if the pair were indeed performing a romantic tango rather than fighting, although the glint of the knife as it moved from person to person and place to place revealed otherwise. Every move from Chris was met with a countermove by Alexander, every countermove of his met with another move from her. At last, one of her kicks managed to evade him, her legs slicing through the air at his chest. Yet at the last second, Alexander slid to the side and Chris stumbled forward, still locked in their deadly embrace and clutching her knife. Alexander used this moment to reach his arms out and pick up Chris, preparing to throw her over his shoulder. In this moment, the tension was almost tangible, as viewers noticed that their noses were just touching and their eyes met each other with a firm determination. They let out a shallow breath in unison, and Chris tentatively reached out a finger to stroke his cheek, as if they were on a date rather than about to kill each other, seemingly imagining the final note of the musical climax to their deadly tango. As it grazed the surface of his cheek, a few lone tears rolled down onto her finger from his watering eyes. He shook them off dismissively, trying to rid himself of his emotions, but Chris smiled ruefully and told him that this was the most emotions she had seen out of him since he broke off their engagement. With this, Alexander leaned down and pressed the tiniest of kisses to Chris's lips before jerking back and body slamming her onto the ground behind him. In the same motion, he pried her fingers off the knife and grasped it in his own hand, straddling her body as Chris laughed through her own tears and reminded him of the old times when they had assumed this exact position after some of their more romantic dates. Alexander smiled sadly and quietly replied that he may not have ever understood Chris and her actions, but that at least now, after all they had been through in the past few weeks, he could forgive her and move on. She smiled and thanked him, tears forming in her eyes, before laughing a tiny bit more and congratulating him for beating her fair and square. As Alexander leaned down and pressed their foreheads together for a final goodbye, he thought back to the night at the apartment when Adrian had asked him if he could truly kill Chris should they end up in the final two, and shouted for Adrian to listen carefully to what he was about to say. Gritting his teeth, he called up to the sky that he had not understood before when Adrian had asked this question, but now truly realized how he would answer it. Any normal person would have refused to kill someone they cared about so deeply in the final showdown. They would have searched for any other option, any potential loophole or way that they could win together. Yet he shouted into the open air that Adrian had forgotten that him and Chris were not normal people, that they were careers. They had been trained to do this with the full knowledge that only one could win and were prepared to do what they needed to do to uphold the honor of their district. As he finished this statement, he faltered slightly and began to show a degree of uncertainty as he gazed into her fearful eyes, but Chris nodded weakly below him in agreement and admitted that she would have said the same. Almost as if confirming that this was what he needed to hear, he nodded at her through the tears streaming down his cheeks and onto her torn green shirt before grimly plunging the knife into her heart. She wheezed involuntarily upon impact and cupped Alexander's face in her pale hands, softly asking if her death would be forgiveness in his eyes. He shook his head, quietly repeating the same phrase that he had said to Adrian the night after the interviews. He could forgive, but he could never forget. Smiling with tired eyes, he commented that this phrase now had new meaning for him. With the deed done, both of them began to weep uncontrollably, Alexander burying his head in Chris's shoulder and letting the sweet strawberry scent of her hair wash over him. She stroked his hair, gently hushing him, until her hands slowed to a stop and her shallow breathing ceased. Over the sound of a distant cannon, head gamemaker Marin declared that Alexander Nicolain was the victor of the 104th Hunger Games. He slowly rose his head from Chris's body with haunted eyes, realizing he had no choice but to allow the hovercraft to take her fragile body away. To many viewers, Alexander appeared numb and stiff as he boarded the hovercraft descending to take him away. He refused to look back down at the arena, appearing withdrawn as his hands trembled with tension, yet he seemed to carry a calm defiance after his closing words. Even Rosalia Sanchez could not quite read the expression on his face as he was transported to safety, judging it to be a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. For his victor's interview, Alexander was dressed in a crisp black suit with emerald undertones, intended to imitate the onyx produced in his district and pay homage to Chris's interview dress. His face was firmly set in a cool expression throughout the interview, though he appeared restless and continually fidgeted with his tie and cufflinks. Rosalia had worn a smooth, bottle green snakeskin dress for the occasion, provoking oohs and ahs from the audience in an attempt to lighten the distant mood between the victor and interviewer. The interview itself was rather somber, conducted with a degree of discomfort as many could sense that Alexander was not in a mood to open up and chat in front of a large crowd and seemed pensive. Rosalia commended him for his bravery in the arena and willingness to work with his ex-fiancée, giving him the victor's nickname of Lost Lover, to which he quietly murmured something about a Pyrrhic victory. Alexander's interview was shorter than those of the victors from past years, as he mumbled his thanks to Rosalia after just a few minutes and left the stage amid hesitant applause. Head gamemaker Marin was invited in next for the much-anticipated interview, discussing next year's games, the first quinquennial quell of the third incarnation, and the sixth overall. They wore a bright green boutonniere that seemed to be made from a combination of grass and sandy material, and appeared in high spirits after the success of this year's games due to its emotional finale, which quickly helped turn the audience's indifference over Alexander's interview into excitement over getting to hear news about the upcoming quinquennial quell. They did admit, however, that they had received some criticism for allowing such a chaotic bloodbath that resulted in the surviving tributes being scattered around and not causing action. They first sent their condolences to Alexander and the family of Chris Gracely, as well as expressed their surprise at the shortness of this year's games and their disappointment that they did not get the opportunity to implement any arena events, but promised that next year's games would certainly deliver in a much more entertaining and unique manner, with a highly unusual twist that would surely see tributes unlocking their inner creativity. While once again mischievously refusing to reveal any more information about the upcoming games, as it was a quell, Rosalia commented that she would take their word for it, and eagerly await the 105th games. After winning and returning home to District 1, Alexander spent most of his time on his own, living a solitary existence. When asked about his games in interviews, he was noted to frequently clam up and insist that the interviewer simply watch the games themselves instead of asking him about it, often staring at the ground and refusing to answer questions. Nearly a decade after his victory, he reconnected with and married a childhood friend. Together they had a daughter, whom he named Chris. Alexander began to heavily rely on alcohol after his victory and would occasionally embarrass himself at Capitol parties by becoming drunk and behaving poorly. Once, it was reported that he paid off an entertainer that had been hired to leap out of a cake at the bachelor party of President Mace's nephew, only to leap out himself and startle the unsuspecting guests. This had apparently been to his great amusement and the great irritation of the guests, who had been expecting a scantily clad female dancer at their event and had instead been greeted by an intoxicated young man in a polka-dot party hat. Alexander attempted to quit his alcoholism after his marriage and the birth of his daughter, but unfortunately continued to struggle with it for the rest of his life. Eventually, his wife had had too much and the pair were separated, with his wife retaining custody of their daughter. He would go on to mentor future District 1 tributes while seeing a Capitol therapist. One notable incident occurred in which he threatened to injure another victor with an egg cup at a party, after claiming they had looked at him strangely, and becoming quite agitated, shouting that they had just as much blood on their hands as him. While his therapist suggested that he might be projecting his own frustrations with his victory onto others, he allegedly refused to believe this and threw a glass vase at the wall in fury, resulting in his detainment at a psychiatric facility for 2 weeks. However, with the help and companionship of a later District 1 victor, Alexander was able to work with his tributes in a more constructive way and proved to be a skilled mentor with a strong desire to see his tributes succeed in the arena. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed this installment of Panem Reborn, File 104. I really hope you'll continue to watch and support the series. I've been really glad to see all the kind comments and the likes that I have seen, so thank you so much for providing those. And also, as usual, I would like to plug the Panem Reborn Discord, which is linked below in the description. I promise that Alexander is not holding a sword to my head, and there are no snakes that are going to come up and bite you if you do not join. But still, please join. So I hope you guys have a good day, night, evening, morning, afternoon, whatever. And thank you so much for watching. And don't forget, Panem today, Panem tomorrow, Panem forever.